Step 3, identify the form or the genre of the passage. A summary of this step. An important key to understanding the passage is to be able to identify the form or the genre of the passage and interpret it correctly. Introduction. This phrase, literary genre, refers to a category or a type of literature. Modern examples would include poetry, a crime novel, a short story, a biography, a newspaper article, an academic textbook, a phone book, or a cartoon. In other words, if you have any piece of literature, you classify it as one or sometimes more of these categories of genre. And knowing the genre of a piece of written material is extremely important for interpreting it correctly. So, for example, we tend to read history differently to the way that we read a novel or we read poetry. And we certainly read the front page of a newspaper differently to the way that we read a songbook or a book on car maintenance. We may not consciously be aware of it, but we're making decisions about the genre of a written piece and how to interpret it. We do that sort of thing all the time. And the Bible contains many different types of literature, many different genres. And each of these need to be read and interpreted differently. So, for example, the historical books of the Old Testament need to be read differently to the letters of Paul, for example, or the final book of the Bible, Revelation. And so for that reason, identifying genre is really important for us in our exegesis of the Bible, as we study the Bible in depth. In fact, the New Testament scholar Thomas Schreiner writes this: perhaps the most important issue in interpretation is the issue of genre. One difficulty we face when it comes to interpreting the Bible is that the types of literature that we find there in the Bible are often unfamiliar to us. We don't read many other things that are written over 1900 years ago. And so that's why it's helpful for us to have some sort of guide to what the different types of biblical genre are and how we should understand them. Well, that's what we have in table 1 of the notes. Just look at that table with me, table 1, as we look at the different genres in the Bible. Notice, first of all, the genre called apocalyptic. That's a highly symbolic type of literature. So you may be aware that the book of Revelation is apocalyptic literature. But there are also some examples in the Old Testament too, in the prophetic books, in the book of Daniel, for example, or the book of Ezekiel. Apocalyptic. Look at the principles for interpreting apocalyptic literature. This is symbolic language, we're told, which is not meant to be taken literally. We need to determine what the symbolism means and why this imagery has been used. Look at the second category, the second genre, epistle or letter. That's a fairly, I think, familiar type of literature for us. So we know that Paul's letters in the New Testament and Hebrews and James and the other general letters are in this sort of category. But look at the principles. We need to identify the issues and the individuals originally addressed. It cannot be assumed that because one person or group was told this once, that it therefore applies in the same way to everybody at all times, in all places. Look at the third genre, exposition or teaching. That's a carefully reasoned argument or explanation. And again, we know that Paul's letters are full of that kind of teaching, as well as the general epistles as well. Look at the principles though. We must follow the logic of the argument or explanation as it's presented. We need to identify the specifics of the original historical context. We need to consider if any figurative language is being used. Look at the fourth type of genre in Table 1. Narrative or story, historical accounts. Well, in the Old Testament, Genesis all the way through to Ezra are those kinds of books, narrative, historical accounts. In the New Testament, we only need to go as far as the Gospels or Acts to find that sort of historical account, that sort of narrative. But look at the principles. We must understand the history as it is conveyed, but also be aware of why it has been presented in the particular way that it has. Why have these events been recorded and others not recorded? Why have they been arranged and conveyed in the manner that they have? Look at number 5, genre 5, parable. That's a brief oral story, a spoken story, illustrating moral truth. Well, we find parables in the Old Testament in certain parts, but we particularly know, don't we, that Jesus tells parables. And so the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are full of these kinds of stories that Jesus tells. But look at the principles. Usually only one main truth is being emphasized. Don't try to find hidden meanings in all of the details of the story, but take note of clues and explanations in the surrounding passages. Genre number 6, poetry. We know that Job and Psalms and Proverbs and Ecclesiastes and Song of Solomon, particularly the wisdom literature in the Old Testament, is full of this kind of poetry. But we also find it in various places in the prophets as well. But look at the principles. We must take into account any symbols or figurative language that's being used. Poetry is not meant to be taken literally, and the overall effect of a poem will be more than simply the meaning of the words. The feelings and emotions are significant here. But look at the 7th genre on the table, prophecy. Now, it's important for us to realize that prophecy in the Bible is not just about predicting what's going to happen in the future. No, it is often about bringing the word of the Lord, God's word, into a particular situation, into what is happening now. And so prophecy has both a present and a future aspect to it. And we find this sort of prophecy, don't we, in Isaiah through to Malachi. But let's look at the principles for understanding it properly. Understanding the history of the original setting is key to our understanding of the prophecy. Prophecy was intended to be understood by those who originally heard it. It's not just about what's going to happen in the future. It has an impact on those who hear it first of all. Poetic and figurative language must be understood in those terms. Poetically, figuratively, not literally. And then the last genre mentioned in Table 1, proverb. That's a short, pithy statement of an aspect of moral truth. And strangely enough, we find proverbs in Proverbs. But also we find proverbs not just in that one book of the Bible, but in various other places in the Bible too. Well, look at the principles that we should use. Take into account the figurative, poetic, the symbolic language that's being used in the proverb. Proverbs are observations about how the world normally works. They're not promises that it will work like this in every situation. So that's some of the genres that we can find in the Bible. We could also add law, for example, to that table. Law that we find in the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible. Now please stop the video at this point to carefully read through Table 1. Different genres within books of the Bible. In Table 1, different books of the Bible have been classified according to their genres. But it's really important to realize that different passages within the same book may represent different genres. So take, for example, the Gospel of Luke. Within Luke, we find parable, we find proverb, we find narrative, we find pronouncements. Lots of different genres within that one gospel. The same in Paul's letters. We find material that could be described as a diatribe. That's a style of literature that used rhetorical questions, a sort of conversational style. But we also find within Paul's letters hymns. I don't know whether you've realized it, but Philippians chapter 2, verses 6 to 11 is probably an early Christian hymn. But then, of course, we find epistle, it's a letter, and exposition. We find a variety of different genres within Paul's letters. And that's really important as we prepare to preach, that we think not just about the genre of the book as a whole, but the genre of the particular passage that we're looking at. What is its literary form? We need to understand it so that we can interpret it correctly. Some common genre mistakes that people make in reading the Bible. First of all, figurative and poetic language must not be taken in a literalistic manner, but must be interpreted as figurative or poetic language. So, for example, the 144,000 of Revelation 7 or Revelation 14 should not be understood as the literal number of people who will enter heaven. That's the way some people have understood it. But Revelation, remember, is an example of apocalyptic literature. And that type of literature often uses numbers figuratively, symbolically. And so in this case, 144,000 is a way of talking about the full number of God's people. 12 times 12 times 1,000. Next, Proverbs should not be read as promises or laws. Think, for example, about Proverbs chapter 16, verse 31, which says this: "Grey hair is a crown of splendor. It's attained by a righteous life." But that shouldn't lead us to conclude that every person with grey hair is righteous, nor that those who don't have grey hair are not righteous. The Proverbs are generalized observations or principles. They're not intended to be treated as laws, nor as absolute divine promises. Sometimes the Proverbs use overstatement to illustrate a point. Sometimes the Proverbs outline an observation of the way life is without making any real evaluation of whether it's a good thing or a bad thing. And sometimes a proverb is true only in certain situations. Look, for example, at Proverbs chapter 26, verses 4 and 5. Look at verse 4. "Do not answer a fool according to his folly, or you yourself will be just like him." But then look at the very next verse. "Answer a fool according to his folly, or he will be wise in his own eyes." You see, the reader requires wisdom to both understand and apply the proverb at the right time. History is not necessarily normative. There's a danger that when we read the history of God's people in the Old Testament or in the New Testament book of Acts, we assume that what we're reading is normative. In other words, that we should imitate it, or we should expect something similar to happen to us. So, for example, there are those who read the book of Acts and they claim that every Christian should speak in tongues as a sign that they really are a Christian. But we need to remember that the book of Acts is describing a unique period in salvation history. The Lord Jesus has just ascended, and he sent his Spirit upon the church so that the gospel could go out from Jerusalem to Judea and Samaria and even to Rome at the end of the book, to the ends of the earth. Likewise, the characters of the Old Testament are not simply role models for us to imitate. Sometimes it's the exact reverse. They show us what we shouldn't be like. Often the historical narrative is told without any comment whatsoever, and the reader has to decide whether what's being described here is good or evil. History is not necessarily normative. But lastly, prophecy, notice, has a historical context. Prophecy has a historical context. As we read the prophecies of the Bible, we need to ask ourselves, what is the significance of this prophecy for the original audience? And only then, once we've worked out what it meant for the original audience, can we then work out what this prophecy means for us today. Let's look at some examples. For each of these biblical examples, you need to decide, first of all, what is the literary form of the passage? And then secondly, you need to use table 1 to work out what principles apply to interpreting this kind of literature. So please pause the video at this point to complete the exercise. So Romans 3, verses 1 to 4. What's the literary form or the genre? Well, it's epistle. It's exposition. It's actually a psalm as well. It's poetry. It's diatribe. There's a real mix of genres in those few verses. Luke 16, verses 1 to 13. What's the genre? Well, it's historical narrative. It's parable. It's exposition. What about Proverbs 14, verse 23? What's the genre there? Well, it's proverb, but it's also poetry. 1 Kings 12. What's the genre of that passage? Well, that is historical narrative. And then Revelation 12, verses 1 to 9. What's the genre? Well, it's apocalyptic. But we also need to remember that the book itself is a letter. Well, finally then, some questions to ask ourselves as preachers about this step. Have I identified the genre of the book, the biblical book that I'm looking at? Secondly, have I identified the genre of the passage that I'm looking at? And then thirdly, have I considered the principles that apply to interpreting this type of literature?